Welcome to the third session of the CoRE conversation. I'm John Lim, Professor and Executive Director of the Center of Regulatory Excellence, or CoRE, at the Duke National University of Singapore Medical School, or Duke-NUS. In 2021, I had the pleasure of interviewing Ms. Emma Cook, Executive Director of the European Medicines Agency, for the inaugural conversation. And last year, our guest was Dr. Peter Honig, a member of CoRE's advisory board. I'm delighted that we're continuing this series today with my good friend, Dr. Murray, or Mac Lumpkin, who's Deputy Director, Integrated Development and Lead for Global Regulatory Systems Initiatives at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Prior to assuming this role in 2014, Mac was Deputy Commissioner for International Programs at the US FDA for 11 years, which was when I first got to know him when I was with the Health Sciences Authority of Singapore. Mac is now currently a visiting expert at CoRE, and he would be very familiar to those in the audience who have attended our annual graduate certificate module on the fundamentals of health products regulation. And in fact, although we're doing this virtually today, Mac will be in Singapore next week as one of the key faculty helming this module as we return to an in-person format. So we're looking forward to catching up in person. As you may know, the CoRE conversation provides an opportunity to hear from global regulatory and healthcare leaders on their professional journeys and life experiences, and what are the key factors that have motivated and inspired them in their careers. So I hope this conversation and what you hear today will provide valuable insights as you progress and develop as regulatory professionals and leaders in your respective areas of endeavor and organizations. We have incorporated questions that were submitted earlier by those of you at the point of registration, but if time permits, there will be an opportunity towards the end of this session for you to pose any outstanding questions you may have using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. But with that, let me stop talking and formally welcome Mac. Thank you very much, Mac, for agreeing to take part in today's conversation. And I'm sure our audience are as eager to gain key insights from your vast experience and expertise as I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. But as we usually do in these conversations, can we go back to the very beginning, as it were, to learn a bit more about your developmental years? And I was wondering if you could take us back in time and tell us about your childhood and interests growing up. Mac, over to you.
Oh, thank you, John. And let me first say how honored I am to be a part of this evening, and how deeply much I appreciate the invitation to be with you. I'm extremely grateful for all the people that have come in the middle of the evening there in Singapore to be part of this. So again, thank you very, very much. Going back in time, I grew up in a small town in the Appalachian Mountains here in the United States, and I was the fourth generation of my family to grow up in the house in which I grew up. My great-grandparents grew up there, my grandparents, my dad, and then we did. So, I really grew up with a very definite sense of family and of place and of roots. And I always loved riding my horse and hiking and camping in the mountains. And as John knows, when he's visited me, the mountains remain a very definite part of my life. And, it sounds a bit idyllic, and in many ways it was, but, this was the 1960s and the 1970s, and it was a time of great change and excitement and turbulence and uncertainty in the US and many, many parts of the world. And all of that also had a great impact on me, even there in the mountains. I mean, I was a typical 1960s teenager. I actually had hair in those days, and it was long, and I loved rock and roll, and I still love rock and roll. And I was protesting the various issues of the day. But what I remember most is I had these incredibly wonderful teachers to whom I'm really most grateful because they brought all of kind of the current events of the world into our classroom and we talked about them. And they really made for me the larger world very exciting and very enticing. And so there was always this longing to go beyond my mountains and to experience the larger world. And I really do thank my teachers for that. And so I thought in many ways that's what was going to define me. Because growing up, I always had this kind of dream that maybe one day I would be an ambassador and I could be in the diplomatic service. And that's kind of where I thought I was going. And then when I was 11 years old, I was swimming in a lake near my home and I cut my foot underwater. And because it was underwater, it got infected with an anaerobic microorganism called Clostridium, and it developed into gas gangrene. My parents tell me that for the first few days after the infection developed, they thought they were going to have to amputate my right leg below my knee. But I was extremely fortunate. I had absolutely terrific medical care and 7 operations, and I think half of the world's supply of penicillin later. I only ended up losing half of my right foot. But what it did for me, I became incredibly interested that there were these invisible microbes that could cause this kind of problem, and that there were these medicines that you could use to fight them. And that's where my interest in medicine began. And also, I'll say, this kind of continual struggle that I've had all my life of, my first love of the diplomatic corps and wanting to be an ambassador, and then this love of medicine and this kind of second interest in becoming a physician.
Well, thank you, Mac. I mean, after having known you for all these years, this is the first time I'm hearing all these details of your childhood, and it really does begin to clarify for me your interests. Every time you tell me you're out hiking in the mountains and you disappear for several days at a stretch, I'm beginning to see where all that comes from now. So thank you for contextualizing. I think not just for me, but for everyone in the audience today. And also the episode that you had when you had that cut. So I presume I was going to ask you this question because I noticed you've had fellowships in pediatrics, pediatric infectious diseases at Mayo, Fulbright Scholar in the UK, where you pursued a Master of Science in Medical Parasitology and a diploma in Tropical Medicine and Hygiene from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So would you say that your childhood experience and what you went through contributed to your decisions in terms of what you would study when you eventually moved into medicine?
I think absolutely. I was always interested, as I said, from the time I was 11 in microbiology and the ability to identify microbes and then treat them. And, when I had the opportunity in medical school to work in a refugee camp in Bangladesh, again, the great majority of the diseases that we saw were infectious. So I was always kind of drawn to that. Yeah.
And that continues to be an area of interest of yours, I would take it, even though you've moved into many other things. And I know you mainly from a regulatory professional experience, but I think you continue to maintain a very strong interest in those areas of medicine as well, right?
Yeah, I do. I mean, when I finished my medical training, I actually thought I was going to be a real doctor, and came back to the States when I finished my Fulbright, and was indeed a pediatric infectious disease doctor at a tertiary hospital for about 3 years. And taking care of critically ill children in a tertiary hospital who had infectious diseases was terrific. And I loved doing it. But again, as I was saying earlier, I always felt something was missing. And I had to try to figure out how to bring together my love of medicine, especially infectious diseases, with my love of diplomacy and government. And that's what brought me to the FDA and then ultimately into global health. And, I think I find that health is one of those things that in the global space, most people agree on. I mean, everybody
Hmm.
wants to be healthy, and it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, what your cultural orientation is, your language, your religion. It's one of the few things that really unites people to a great degree is health. And so I was very, very lucky as I kind of started going out that it was the door that opened for me. Health opened the door for me to bring government, to bring diplomacy, both at the FDA and then now at the Gates Foundation
Hmm.
in the aspect of global health.
But I'm curious, Mac, because before you went into medicine, I know that you have this Bachelor of Arts or in German language and literature from Davidson College. And this one I find very interesting. I suppose it could feed into your interest in diplomacy, but could you tell us a bit more about your interest in language and literature and how from there you found your way into medicine,
Yeah,
diplomacy, regulatory science?
sure, sure. There actually is a thread here, even though it's sometimes hard to see, and it was often hard for me to see. I mean, again, going back where I grew up, at the time I grew up there, you could literally go 2,000 kilometers in any direction and only hear English. Everybody spoke English, so there was never an opportunity to hear a foreign language, to know someone who actually spoke a foreign language routinely on a daily basis. And there was clearly no incentive to learn a foreign language or to use a foreign language. You just didn't need it in that particular kind of environment. It wasn't on the radio, it wasn't on television. But one of the things I also loved to do was to play the piano and the organ. And I especially like German Baroque music. And often I would be playing a Bach chorale, and sometimes the music would be very, very joyous. Sometimes the music would be very, very melancholy. And you could see there were words in there, but they were German words, and I had no idea what they were saying. And I kept wondering, so what are they saying such that he wrote this music to be joyous, or he wrote the music to be melancholy? And so it seemed to me that at that point, and I have come to believe strongly that you are not really educated until you have learned a language other than your mother tongue, and until you've had the opportunity to study in a university and in a culture that is not the culture you grew up in. And I think in our global world today, that is even more important than it was in the dark ages when I was going to university. And I think one of the things that's kind of different about medical education in the United States compared to other parts of the world is we cannot go into medical school immediately upon finishing high school. We are required to get a 4-year university baccalaureate degree before we can even apply to go into medical school. So you have this 4-year period of time where you clearly have to do your basic sciences. You have to do physics, you have to do chemistry, you have to do biology. But at the time I was coming through, there was this emphasis on perhaps having future medical students not focus entirely on the sciences, but focusing on the arts also, with the idea of hopefully becoming a better rounded physician, whatever that means. And I have no idea if that experiment actually worked or didn't work, but at the time, we were encouraged not to do a major in the sciences, to do the basic courses, but to broaden out. And so it gave me the opportunity to actually go overseas for one of my 4 years of my baccalaureate time. And I went to this wonderful German university in Marburg. I was 19 years old. I'd never been out of the United States. I'd never flown on an airplane. I'd never had a passport. My dear parents put me on a plane and sent me to Germany. I was there, I was by myself. I had no idea what to do, where to go. I spoke rudimentary German. This was before the world of cell phones. You couldn't call home. It was way too expensive to call home. And so you kind of had to grow up and you kind of had to learn to speak the language, if you wanted to eat, if you wanted to ride the bus, if you wanted to go anywhere. And, I have to say, in respect, it was probably the best year of my life. I really grew up. I really learned more of the world and what it meant to be and to live in a culture and a place that is very, very different from what you had always been used to. But I always knew that I was going to come back at the end of that, was going to go to medical school once I finished my baccalaureate. And I still read a part of a chapter of a book in German every night before I go to bed to try to keep it up. But you can ask Silke. I don't have the opportunity to speak it, and my accent and my vocabulary, I know, have gotten really, really rusty.
Well, you can practice this next week when you speak to Silke when you're in Singapore, and we can see how it goes from there.
No. I wouldn't subject Silke to that. She's much too kind and nice.
But just before we leave this, you have this interest in music, and when I met up with you a few weeks back, right, in New York, and we caught a musical there, and you were telling me that in high school, right, you were very engaged in these sorts of things. So music, you've talked about, of course, German music, Baroque music, but music as a whole continues to be something that interests you, and how does that sort of tie in with your interest in nature when you go hiking, because you go for these long walks? Do you consider that a very important bit in terms of balance and centeredness, in terms of how you live your life now and see the world?
Definitely. I mean, I think, as we all during COVID, you kind of had to have things that grounded you because the world was so different and things were going so crazy and falling apart, and there was so much uncertainty. I always find that if I can get out in the mountains and do my walk, it's incredibly reassuring because the mountains don't change. At least they don't change quickly. It takes them eons and eons to change. And you would go out, and despite all the craziness in the world, the animals were the same, the plants and the trees were the same. The mountains were the same. And there was this reassurance that, the sun's coming up, the earth is here, life is going on, that there is a certain continuity and consistency that brings. On the music front, it's something that is, very personal to me. I never really play for other people. I would be too embarrassed to do that. But I know my family has learned that if I'm playing like a Chopin Polonaise, don't mess with me. That means I'm really stressed out and I'm really going, bah, 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 bah. It just lets you play the aggressions and the frustration out. On the other hand, if, we're doing something light and simple and fun, it is a way to kind of deal with what you're feeling and what your emotions are, and a great stress reliever for me.
Yeah, so we'll come back to this issue of stress because now let's swing the conversation a bit to your career. And you've had a very successful career spanning senior leadership positions in the public and private sectors. And of course, prior to your current role in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, since 2014, you had an extended period of service at the US FDA, where you were director of the Anti-Infective Drugs Division, then deputy center director at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, and finally deputy commissioner for international programs for 11 years. So, Mac, tell us a bit more about your experiences across all that time in the FDA, and perhaps what have been the three biggest lessons from your career as a senior government regulator?
It's a great question, and it's always fun to think back on one's career because it has so many highlights and points and so many lowlights too. And you learn from all of these. I think one of the things that I learned during my 25 years at FDA was that being in the fishbowl and being on the front pages of the newspaper and having people second guess you all the time is simply part of the job. And you have to be comfortable with it. It's never comforting, but you have to be comfortable. And the way I became comfortable with it, at least emotionally, was I finally realized that all of that is a tremendous compliment. The reason you're in the fishbowl, the reason people are second guessing you is because what you're doing matters to a lot of people. If they stop putting you in the fishbowl, if they stop asking questions, what they're really saying is what you're doing doesn't matter. And I think in the regulatory agency space, what you do really does matter. And so this is just part of the job, and you have to realize that it is a tremendous compliment because it means what you're doing matters to the people you're trying to serve. I think the other thing that you learn quickly is that you have to keep perspective about yourself. I think when you're on a platform like an HSA or an FDA, where people always answer your phone call and people are interested in what you have to say, you have to remember you are not a Nobel Prize winning scientist. You know, people are calling you and answering your phone and interested in what you have to say because of the title you have, because of the platform that you're on. And one day you're going to be off that platform and you're going to have to come to peace with the fact that the way people respond to you when you're on the platform versus when you're off the platform later is very, very humbling. And so kind of keeping a perspective about yourself and the tremendous privilege you have to occupy that platform for a period of time is absolutely wonderful. Um, Another thing I think is that often when you are doing a job in a country's regulatory agency, you realize you're the only person in your country that's doing that job. There's not another agency. There's not somebody else doing that job. And so you begin to get a bit lonely and wonder who your peers are and who really understands the challenges that you're faced with. And you have to realize that, you know, you might not have a peer in your own country, but there are people in other agencies in the world who are doing the same job you are. And they are your peers, and they are a wonderful sounding board when you have challenges. And so I think that was one thing that I had to learn, and I loved learning, was who my peers were around the world and who I could call on just to bounce things off and say, what do you think? Because they were wearing the same shoes I was wearing. And I guess the last thing that I would say, and I realize this is four instead of three, but I think it's very, very important that you always keep in mind that anytime you make a decision, that what should be important to people and what people discuss is why you made the decision, not how you made the decision. That the why is the interpretation of the science. And people can have honest disagreements about interpreting science. And we should have open, honest discussions about what the science is telling us. And I think it's perfectly all right for people to disagree with your decision if they have an honest disagreement on how to interpret the science. That's the why you made the decision. If the question is how you made it, then you have a problem because the process for making the decision needs to be clear, needs to be transparent, needs to be predictable. Because if they're arguing about the process, then you get into a whole issue that's not science-based, and it has to do with perception and was this done appropriately? And it's a whole different scope of problems. So as long as you can keep the focus on the why and make sure that the how is clear and unambiguous and transparent, you will be well served.
Can we stay on that last point, your fourth point, since you gave us four instead of three? This issue of the process, and I want to link it to your comment about engaging with peers in other countries and other national regulatory authorities, because the processes can be quite different, right? As we've seen over the years, there's been probably greater convergence more recently, but certainly when I think we look back 10, 20 years, it was not necessarily so. And when you were in your role Deputy Commissioner of International Programs, engaging with other NRAs from the FDA, how did you sort of deal with these kind of issues? Because, I mean, FDA is a very large organization compared to many other national regulatory authorities around the world. And obviously, the processes would not be able to match to the same degree what or how the FDA does things. So what sort of experiences did you have there in terms of engaging with peers overseas and maybe sort of helping to refine either their processes or processes even within the FDA?
Yeah, I mean, I think even though you might have different processes, the fundamentals underlying the process are generally the same. I think if the process is science-based, if the process is transparent, if the process is looking at what are the clinical trials telling us about efficacy, what are they telling us about safety, what is the benefit risk profile of this product, actually, you find out you generally come to the same interpretive place and the same understanding, whether your process is to do it bottom up like the FDA traditionally does, or if you do it top down like many other agencies do. You tend to come often to the same understanding of what the clinical trials are saying. Where people diverge, and I think this is really important, and I always found it really fascinating, is not so much in what are the clinical trials telling us, but then we have to use that to make a decision, and we have to know what is the risk tolerance within our own population. Will our population accept this benefit risk profile? And often that's different. That's not the science of regulation. That to me is the art of regulation. The clinical trials don't tell you that. They don't tell you, well, okay, your population will accept this or they will not accept this. And I always felt that most of the time, if there was a different regulatory outcome, it was not that we had a fundamental disagreement on what the science was telling us. It's that there was a disagreement in the risk tolerance of our populations for a product with that characteristic. And there can be all kinds of reasons why that would be true. And you experienced it, I'm sure, at HSA and others, and people in industry must experience it all the time when they submit the same dossier and they get different regulatory outcomes. I mean, how can this be? And I think it can be because healthcare systems are different, people are different, their perception of risk are different, what their community is willing to accept when it comes to risk, given the other choices they might have, play a big role in ultimately whether the product is made available or not. And that's a nuance that, you often have to explain to people who are not in our regulatory ecosystem and not in our space. To us, this is almost second nature. This you deal with on a daily basis. But, when you get a parliamentarian who's questioning you and saying, the EMA approved this. Why did you not? You know, and you have to kind of explain and walk through and talk about this. Um, Again, I think as long as you understand how you got there and why you made your decision, you're okay. They can disagree with you, but it's not that they saying that you did it wrong or that there was something wrong with the process.
Very good, Mac. But coming back to yourself now, tell us about any particular achievements in your time in the regulatory sphere as a regulator that particularly stand out for you.
Mm. You know, during my time at FDA, I think there are probably three things that, you know, as far as like initiatives that stand out. I mean, from a personal perspective, just the incredible friendships, the incredible learning. You know, I think all of us realize when you go into regulatory, it's not something you've really been taught. I don't know how it is in many countries overseas, but in the US, when you go to medical school, you're never taught about the FDA. You're never taught about where drugs come from. You're never taught about how these decisions, which I've always thought was really quite odd because legally you are the gatekeeper for these things. And it's only through you that people have access. And yet, when you're being educated, you're never taught about the process of how these things get there. I've always thought it was a huge failing in our medical education system. So having that opportunity to grow and to learn and to be mentored by people at FDA on what regulation is, how regulation is done, how you can do it well, how you can do it poorly. But on the initiatives, I guess my three initiatives, one is the pediatric legislation that came out in the 1990s. I mean, as a pediatrician, I fully understood that the drugs were never tested in children, that we were always N of one testing drugs in our children unconsented, based on kind of what people had told us or best guesses. And I think that legislation and the discussion around the legislation really changed the discussion and the narrative from it's unethical to do trials in children to it's unethical not to do trials in children. And getting the pediatric legislation and changing that narrative is something that I really was very proud to be a part of. I think the other was, again, in the early 1990s, implementing the user fee legislation, because we'd never had that before. And it really gave us a chance to have an internal discussion of how we were going to implement project management in the review process, how we could make the review process a managed process without sacrificing safety, efficacy, and quality of products. The fact that performance metrics are important and they are now going to be public and we're going to be held accountable for not only making the right decision, but making the right decision in an agreed time frame, which was a very new concept at FDA. And I think being part of the implementation of that. And then finally, I think the third one for me would be establishing FDA's overseas offices. Up until then, FDA had been a very inward-looking organization. Its mission is clearly inward. It is there to protect and promote the health of the American people. And it came out of a time where most of the products were locally made. But as all of you remember, back in the late 80s and early 90s, we were going through a period of huge globalization within the pharmaceutical industry. So many more products were coming in to the US, and FDA had to change its outlook from being just an inwardly looking organization to one that had more of a global look if it was going to do the job that our Congress had given it to do. So working with our overseas counterparts to set up FDA offices in Beijing and Delhi and in Central America and South America, and particularly I'm so proud of the liaison office that's now been going on for well over 20 years between the EMA and the FDA, where there's an FDA person every day permanently in Amsterdam, and there's an EMA person permanently every day in Silver Spring. And, that has done so much to help people understand how another agency whom we all respect very, very highly does its work. And it does it differently. And it's a different organization. It's a network of agencies, and understanding that and how we can work together better. I think those were the three that, as I look back, I would say I was most proud of.
Well, it's a great legacy. It's wonderful, that, as you said, it's still carrying on, especially the international offices, 20 years on, and still going strong. So that's a wonderful legacy, I think, for you to have left, which still continues to influence a lot of people around the world.
There were many people other than me that did it, John. It's not a personal legacy. It's an institutional
well, it's a collective
legacy.
institutional
I just
legacy.
happened to be there.
Yeah. Was there one significant piece of advice that anyone gave you that influenced your career decision or guided you along in a certain way?
Yeah, I think, again, I know you're going to have trouble thinking that I know how to count, but I think there was an advice from the personal side and there was advice from the professional side. Going back to when I went to Germany as this naive 19-year-old, totally lost in the world, one of the things that I had to do was get a German visa. And I had to get it after I got there because I was going to be there for a full year and I was going to matriculate and be a student in the university there. And at that time, in order to get your visa, you had to have an examination by a German physician. Well, I knew nothing about the German healthcare system. I knew no doctors in this town. I had no idea how I was going to get this. I wasn't even sure I was doing the right thing. So I went to the phone book, and the first person in the phone book who had the German word for doctor after their name, I called that number and made an appointment. And they gave me an appointment, and I dutifully walked down into town on that day and walked in and realized that I had made a huge mistake because I had made an appointment with a gynecologist. And, it was like, here I was 19. I was in this room with all of these women, and I thought, something was wrong in the translation here. And finally, this wonderful physician came out and he took me back. And a very long story short, he did everything. He signed the visa. I'm sure I'm the only person, male, who ever got a German visa signed off by a gynecologist. But he told me, he said, I knew when you called, when they told me that, this was going to be something that you would remember the rest of your life. And that if you really wanted to learn our language, you have to make mistakes. You have to be able to laugh at yourself. You have to, that's how you learn. And he said, you will remember this the rest of your life. And I think this idea of being able to laugh at yourself, to realize that you're going to make really, really, really stupid mistakes, and that's how you learn. I think from the professional side, on the third day, I was at FDA after being hired in the early 1990s. It was during the height of the HIV/AIDS initial epidemic in the US. And on that third day, the HIV activists staged their protest outside of the FDA building, and they threw bags of blood up against the walls of the building. And I was standing up many, many floors above, looking down, watching this happen. And they were yelling, FDA, you are protecting us to death, which they were absolutely right. But this was a watershed moment, I think, for the FDA and also for me, that you realize that, it again matters what you do, and you have to do it within the context of the risk that the patients are willing to take. Because at the end of the day, it's not FDA that's taking the risk. It's not the company that's taking the risk. It's the patients that are going to take the risk, and particularly the risk of what we don't yet know about a product. And we kind of learned this again during COVID, where again, you had to make that decision. Yeah, we don't know everything. We're not going to know everything, but do we know enough in the context of when we need to make this decision? And, we learned in COVID where people were dying in large numbers, economies around the world were falling. People were willing to take a lot of risk with products. And the fact that we didn't yet know everything about these products that we would like to know. And the same was true with the HIV epidemic in the early 1990s. And I think this advice that came not from a person, but from an event is what was really very formative for my regulatory professional side.
Thank you for sharing that, Mac. Very powerful. But now that you've mentioned COVID, and I think we've sort of just coming out of the pandemic, I think let's spend some time talking about this, because you've thought deeply about this and experienced this, well, even as you've been in the foundation. And we know, of course, that this is not the last pandemic. So from your vantage point, what do you think were the key lessons that have been learned from navigating the regulatory landscape during the COVID-19 pandemic? And were there unexpected positive outcomes or innovations that emerged as a result of the pandemic's impact on regulatory practice? And also, what do you think could have been handled better or differently? Several questions in one, but I think it's just to seek your thoughts on the pandemic and the lessons for us going forward.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's several things. And again, a lot of my view is, from the perspective of low-income countries, because I tended to view the pandemic from that perspective, from a professional perspective. I think some of the positives, one, as we've just mentioned, is, we've gone from the early 1990s when we had no idea about looking at risk and looking at risk in terms of context, to actually having formal mechanisms like emergency use authorizations, emergency use listings that allowed us procedurally to do exactly that. So I think we had learned a lot from previous epidemics, such that we had the regulatory tools that we needed. I mean, if you think about it, we didn't have to create a single new regulatory tool. We were able to use the regulatory tools that we had in order to do it. And people had the flexibility, and the tools gave us the flexibility to do contextual regulation, which is what we should be doing all the time. It was just in the context of a pandemic, how do you regulate? I think the other thing was just the incredible good luck that we had, that we were able to do regulation by Zoom. I mean, I try to think what it would have been like if it had happened in the 1990s before we had this technology. And we were all on telephones, handheld sets, calling each other, trying to figure out and deal with it. Whereas, regulators could get together literally almost instantaneously. Nobody had to fly, nobody could fly, nobody had to get visas, but people were able to come together. And even in the low-income country setting, we were able to get, large numbers of regulators together to have simultaneous translation, where people could talk in their own language, they could hear in their own language, and really understand what was going on and make decisions in a much better informed manner than I think we've ever had before. So the internationalization, the cooperation, both at the ICMR level and then at the regional level in different parts of the world, were, to me, very, very unexpected positive outcomes, where I think people will look back and say the regulators really stepped up and did what they needed to do and used the tools they had in incredibly good, flexible ways. There were prices paid for that. I mean, in the sense of people being extremely stressed, extremely overworked. I'm not one of these that think, oh, well, that should be business as usual. I mean, it can't be business as usual. You can't go on a pandemic footing 24/7 all the time, but trying to pick from that how you could use certain things in a business as usual perspective are some of the things going forward. I think there were two things on the negative side that we really could have done better. One was very early on, there was no control over the innumerable bad studies, particularly the bad studies of available products. I think we all knew they were never going to be able to give interpretable data. They were never designed to do that. There was just this rush to try to see, to do. And I think it ended up confusing more than it ended up helping. And we saw a lot of bad outcomes, a lot of bad decisions made on bad data from bad trials. And I think, if we could do that better, if we could figure out some way in the next pandemic to do proper trials of the products that are available so you get interpretable data and not confusing or ambiguous data, that would be a big step forward. The other thing I think we all know is that very early on, the regulators lost control of the narrative in the general public. I think we were unprepared for a pandemic in the world of social media. We were unprepared for how to deal with that, how to deal with disinformation campaigns, with misinformation, and basically just lost control of the narrative. And I think once we lost control of the narrative, then people lost trust because they didn't know whom to believe or what to believe. And we looked like we didn't know what we were saying or didn't have confidence in what we were saying. And it was difficult because, again, you're having to explain nuances to a population that does not live in our regulatory ecosystem and for whom a lot of these concepts are really quite foreign. And so I think, thinking through how do you maintain trust, how do you maintain control of the narrative, or at least control of your narrative so it's heard in a world of social media and a pandemic is something we need to learn before the next one.
Thanks, Mac. There's a question that's come up where the questioner says, you mentioned the numbers of badly designed trials generating low quality evidence during the pandemic. What do you think could be put in place at a global level to prevent this from happening again?
I think there are a couple of things. One is that, obviously, if products are available, people can and will try to use them in ways that they are unauthorized. I think part of it is, trying to be able to say early on that this trial will not give, it's not designed to give interpretable data. I think the journals need to be much more vigilant on what they choose to publish, particularly doing the quick publications if it is not interpretable data. And people need to be able to say that. The press is going to do what the press is going to do. Academicians are going to say what they're going to say, but we need to say, and the journals need to say, these are not data that are helping. These are not interpretable, so that those who are doing the interviewing in the press can go back and ask the investigators. So FDA, HSA, they're saying this is uninterpretable and we shouldn't make anything of these results. What do you say to that? And, that's the discussion that needs to go forward rather than just a blasé acceptance of Dr. So-and-so at institution so-and-so reported the following finding.
Let's move on, Mac, to what you're doing now at the foundation. Can you tell us a bit of your sort of areas of focus and what you're really concentrating on? I'm sure the audience would like to understand a bit more of what you're really doing in this area.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate. In the last 10 years at the Gates Foundation, I've been leading what we call our Global Regulatory Systems Initiative. So I'm really product agnostic. I don't focus on any particular product. I don't do regulatory strategies for individual products. I actually work with the different components of the global regulatory ecosystem through which global health products have to go in order to be legally marketed, procured, and used in the low-income countries that our foundation focuses on. So the people I work with, the people with whom I have grants are like the WHO pre-qualification unit, the regulatory system strengthening work that WHO does, working with regional regulatory initiatives in Africa, in the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia, working with now the continental effort in Africa. So working with the systems and trying to work with partners within those systems to optimize them, again, clearly without compromising efficacy, safety, or quality, but in many efforts really trying to improve the level of oversight of efficacy, safety, and quality so that the products that are available on these markets are indeed international quality products and are not substandard, are not falsified products, and are new products that are being developed to meet many of the diseases that are unique to these parts of the world, but also many of the diseases that we all share in common around the globe, both in low-income countries and high-income countries. So that's what I get to do now. And as I always say, I feel like it's retirement on steroids. It's what I would have wanted to do. And I've just been incredibly blessed to be able to get this job at the foundation as a full-time position.
So still clearly enjoying yourself after 10 years there.
Definitely.
There's an interesting question that was posed. What are the advantages and disadvantages of global regulatory systems? So from your vantage point at the foundation and where you were in the FDA, how would you sort of comment on this one? Advantages and disadvantages of global regulatory systems.
Well, I think one of the advantages is that we always say in science that our kind of metric of truth is peer review. And I think having different agencies looking at data is our form of peer review. I know people love to say one application, one review, one decision. I think that's incredibly short-sighted and very anti-scientific in that that gives you no peer review. It gives you no independent verification of a finding, all of which we have said are fundamentals of good science. So I think if regulatory decision-making is going to be a science, which I think it is, it has to adhere to the fundamental principles of science, of peer review and independent verification. So I think it's great that we have different agencies that have different perspectives and different procedures to see where we come out. It's the only way to know and to try to figure out what truth, scientific truth, really is. And so I find that very reassuring and very good. The thing that I find most difficult, and John knows this because we've had many discussions about it, I find the agencies that look at their confidentiality laws and consider other agencies as they would consider anybody in the general public and not fully share their thoughts, their reviews, their inspections with other agencies really undermines this idea of, verification, independent verification, peer review. I mean, you have to put your cards on the table as to why you did what you did. And that means being transparent. And I think we have to be transparent with each other. None of us have the resources, even FDA with all of its resources and EMA with all of its resources. No one has the resources to do everything that they believe their parliaments are asking them to do and that they think they need to do to meet their mission. And so in a world where the products that we are regulating are global commodities, why is it that we would think regulation would not also be a global undertaking? And part of that then is this open sharing and full sharing of information and thoughts with each other that I think we could do a much, much better job of, that would really support much more of the reliance and reliance-based pathways that everybody, including WHO, now says is a 21st century best regulatory practice.
Mac, there are two more questions in the question and answer box. One is going back a bit to the earlier discussion about the pandemic. How can we stay prepared to fight the next pandemic so we don't get caught off guard next time? And the second question says, despite the learnings from the pandemic, it still seems as if the need for effective IVD and medical device regulation remains a relative afterthought compared to the efforts that go into medicines and vaccines regulation. And how do you think this situation can be changed? Your comments on...
Yeah, no, I think the person who asked particularly the question on the IVDs is spot on. If I had said what was the third thing we did badly, it was the diagnostics. I think, we realized you can't treat a patient until you diagnose them. And, not having a diagnostic that you can trust completely scuppers any kind of therapeutic modality that people want to have. So I think the person is absolutely right. We've been working in ICH on medicines and for 30, 35 years now. Devices has not. There's still tremendous differences in how people approach regulation of devices around the world. Medicines looks totally harmonized in comparison, and we know medicines is not totally harmonized by any means. So I think that's right. Figuring out how we're going to do devices, how we're going to validate devices early in a pandemic so that we can trust the diagnoses that are being made. The other thing I think in the preparation, and we see people doing this right now, is, none of us had any idea about the mRNA technology. We had we'd seen it, but how it could be made into much more of a platform that we can have the platforms ready, hopefully to do the interchangeable antigens once the next pathogen comes around. And hopefully it's one that would work on a platform that we already feel very secure with, at least as far as the platform is concerned. So I think there are efforts, particularly some of the efforts to at least have the goal of having clinical trials ready, clinical trial supplies ready within 100 days, is really a remarkable goal. But you think, even in this last pandemic, I think history is not going to judge us all that badly. When you look at pandemics in the history of mankind, generally they'd have to kill off everybody who's vulnerable and burn themselves out. This is a time where that did not happen, that science gave us the tools, and really, really smart people all around the world gave us the tools to kind of break the pandemic in a way that pandemics have not been able to be broken in the past. So I think there were a lot of very good things that came from it, and a lot of people are thinking through how to prepare better so that we do even a better job next time.
There are still several questions. I'll try and group them together. There have been several questions submitted earlier asking about opportunities, both as a regulatory affairs professional. That question came from Ethiopia. And there are questions related to work in non-profit health sector foundations, as well as people interested in working or joining the Gates Foundation. Could you sort of give broad sort of advice on this? Because this is really meant to be to help people think through their career development going forward.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've learned is that some people, like my dad, for example, had a career that was defined in one chapter. He knew from the day he was born, he wanted to be a surgeon in the small town he grew up in. And that's what he did for his entire life. And he was absolutely fulfilled doing it. As you can tell, my journey has been a journey of many chapters. And I think there is no right way. I mean, you will know when you are feeling fulfilled and if you're not feeling fulfilled professionally, you have to keep your eyes and your ears and your mind open to potential new chapters and have the courage to jump and try. I mean, nothing is written in stone. And there are, nothing is permanent. You can change again. And I think, most things come to people in serendipity. It's you happen to be in the right place at the right time. You hear about something, you're looking for something, and keep your eyes and your ears and your heart open and have courage to jump and try. I think as far as the foundation is concerned, our jobs that are available are on our website. Please go to the website. There are all kinds of different jobs over time. They come up and they're put on the website when they are available. We don't have an internal list and an external list like some organizations do. The jobs that are available are on the website, and you apply and you go through the vetting process and the interview process to do it. Hope that answers it a little bit, John.
Well, it depends on the people who ask the question, but they're free to, I think, pose questions subsequently by email or whatever. But there's another related question in the Q&A box. When we think about the future of what skills regulators and industry colleagues will need to have, what should people be doing to prepare for that?
I know we're at the end of this. The one thing I would say is get an understanding of AI. I think it is incredibly new. It is a tool that is already being used. It is going to be used more and more. And AI is going to be to your generation what computers and computer data were to our generation, something that we had never thought about, something we had to learn. We had to learn how to use that tool and how to use it well. And I think you have an even greater challenge in figuring out this new tool, how to harness it, how to use it, and how to make it effective. And I think it's going to be as much a everyday part of your life as computers came for those of us that grew up in a world when there were not computers.
Thanks, Mac. Let's just take the last question that's still in the Q&A box. Great insights on the processes and the hows, how the scientific decisions are arrived at. What is the foundation doing to help with the hows?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, to me, the process is the how. The why is the decision making and using what comes out of the how to make a decision there. I think what we're doing is trying to work through partners like WHO, like the local NRAs in these countries, to build a skill set. I think we have an incredibly wonderful tool now that never existed in the past, and that's the global benchmarking tool that WHO uses to accredit NRAs as to what their maturity level is. The World Health Assembly has said that it believes that every agency should be at least at an ML3. We know that only about a third of the member states of WHO have agencies that are at ML3 or above. We have the whole new program at WHO now of the WHO listed authorities. And I think so what we're doing is trying to work with those that can help agencies that want to get to ML3, want to get to WLA to get there, because having agencies that are performing at that maturity level will help us tremendously on both the how and the why of regulation.
Very good, Mac. I mean, the question was clarified, but I think you've answered it already. So thank you very much. Well, Mac, it's been an absolute joy to spend this time listening to you and your, not just the stories, but it's just this wealth of wisdom that you have. And I always enjoy listening to you, but it's been particularly excellent today, I think, as we come together. And you can see from all the reactions on the screen, people have really enjoyed it. And also your generosity, I think, in sharing from your very personal stories, things that I've not heard before. But it's been a huge pleasure and an honor to spend this last hour or so with you. And I'm sure our audience today has benefited deeply from your wisdom and perspectives. So I think on behalf of all the audience and all the reactions you see floating across the screen, thank you very much, Mac. Take care, safe trip to Singapore, and we look forward to meeting you in person very soon and hearing more from you in the future. Thank you so much, Mac.
Thank you. It was my extreme pleasure.